we have a dueling battle in which I will be cooking a cheap plum cake.
And I will be cooking a good plum cake. This is a really upsetting color. Here we have our good plum cake batter. I hope you can hear this as well as I can. What a noise. Smells delicious, actually. Despite its funky smell as it originally went in.
Welcome back to our kitchen, where I will be making the cheap plum cake, but I would like to believe it will also be a good plum cake. All right, so the deal with this plum cake is that it's much simpler than the one that Meredith made. Fewer spices, fewer different kinds of fruit in there, and let me just rattle off what's in this. Now, this one is also a cake that's about half the size of the previous cake according to the recipe, so we thirded this one instead of sixthing it. In it, we have 3 pounds of flour, 2 penny worth of cloves. What I also learned is that the cloves and mace, which this calls for, come from Indonesia, and it would have been a long way for it to come. It was a very expensive spice. The price of nutmeg in 1760, from which mace comes, was 85 to 90 shillings per pound, and that was a price that was kept artificially high by the Dutch traders. So we're talking like it's about 315 milligrams of mace and nutmeg. We're gonna call that a pinch. Then we have a half pint of yeast, which we're going to do in a very similar method to what we did before, where we use beer because we figure it's kind of an ale yeast since it's in a large measurement like that. 4 eggs becomes 1.5 eggs. 2 to 3 spoons of rose water. I have less than 1 spoon. Meredith used a tablespoon. I think I'm going to use a teaspoon. So I also have a half pound of butter, have 2/3 a cup of milk, a pound of currants, which again we're using a mix of tart cherries and raisins to kind of approximate the flavor of currants. I have a 6 pound of raisins, which I bring in golden raisins because they're a little sweeter. And then a tiny minuscule amount of sugar, 1/12 of a pound. And we'll talk about that again in a few minutes because it's breaking all the rules of baking, what I'm about to do with this. And then some butter to daub the pan, as the recipe says. Take 3 pounds of the finest biscuit flour you can get. 2 penny worth of cloves and mace. Rub the spice into the flour before it be wet. So we're mixing dry ingredients first, which is kind of like modern baking. Just gonna give my little 315 milligrams of spice in there. 4 eggs well beaten. Rub the spice in the flour. Strain the eggs with 2 or 3 spoonfuls of rose water. I have my yeast in the microwave. Some warm beer. Ew. Gross. And I am going to add in 2 teaspoons of yeast. And we'll let that activate for a few minutes. 4 eggs well beaten. Strain the eggs with 2 or 3 spoonfuls of rose water. Now remember we're thirding this, so I'm gonna use like a little less than a spoonful of rose water, but here goes nothing. There we go. Tiny bit of rose water. A half pound of butter put into a pint of milk as hot as will melt the butter. I have chopped my butter into slices. All right, so my butter has melted down into my milk. And it says now, as hot as will melt the butter, put all these with your hands a good while till it be something stiff. So I'm going to take my flour over here. I guess I'm going to put in the butter first, because it doesn't really give indication on that. Okay, well I don't want my eggs to cook, so maybe I'll do the yeast next. And now I'm going to do eggs. I have to let this rise for a quarter hour. Then put in 3 pounds of currants well picked and half a pound of raisins stoned and cut small, a 1/4 pound of sugar. So I add the sugar after it's risen, which feels very odd because it feels like the sugar would help it rise, but here goes nothing. I'm gonna put my hands in here and... She says until it becomes something stiff. And I gotta tell you, this ain't becoming anything stiff anytime soon. I do have to say that baking from these historical manuscripts is a lot like being on British Bake Off. You have a set of instructions that aren't at all clear.
Oh, it's like the technical.
It is like the technical. They tell you to do something, and sometimes it's out of order, or it's very vague.
Where Paul Hollywood is just like, bake that cake, and all the contestants are like, yes.
I think what that means, though, is that it assumes a certain base level of knowledge. The people cooking this would be very familiar with the kitchen and understand implicitly how this should work. So we're going in the proofing drawer. Oh yeah, we've got a nice yeasty smell coming out of there. Got some little air bubbles. It's not quite as risen as Meredith's was. So this says put it in. I think what that means is we don't want to destroy the air bubbles, so I'm going to try to just fold these in very gently with the sugar and see what happens there, and try to get it evenly distributed. All right, so now we have our dough that's ready to be put into our hoop, which we are using a springform pan for this as well. Kind of replicates a 18th century or 19th century baking hoop because we can pop the cake right out of it. So once I've gotten all this folded in, what we're left is a 1/4 pound of sugar. Put all these in your hoop, being well daubed with butter. I've well daubed it with butter, emphasis on the well. And it says 1 hour will bake it. So again, they're not giving you a temperature. Whoever was manning the fire probably knew what the temperature of the fire should be for baking. So I've had to do some research on kind of fruit cakes and what they should be baked at. And we kind of gathered 325 to 350 for about an hour to an hour and a half. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to get this in the pan. I think that looks pretty good. We are going to pop this into the oven for 1 hour. Make sure. Hello and welcome back. Our cakes have finished cooling on the rack and they are ready to be sliced and eaten. On the left hand side here we have the cheap plum cake looking a little bready and with the currants kind of having risen to the top.
You can see more gluten in there.
Mm-hmm. It looks, yeah, very bread-like. On the right we have
the good plum cake. I think that it looks a little more cake-like as opposed to bread-like.
Okay, so I'm going to start slicing into it and we're going to see what happens. Okay, so we are going to do a taste test now to see which is the superior plum cake.
We're going to try the good plum cake first.
The rosewater flavor is very strong.
It's very prominent. It is not entirely to my taste. It's much more sour than I would have expected.
Even with all that sugar, it's not...
Well, it's actually not all that much sugar in comparison to what we would normally put in a modern day cake, I think.
If the rosewater were a little bit less, it's really not a bad cake.
No, it's really not. I think that it has a really nice crust on all the sides.
Shall we try the cheap plum cake now?
Let's try the cheap plum cake.
All right.
I've got to hand it to cheap plum cake. Cheap is better in this situation. I think for me, a lot of it just owes to that lack of rose water.
I think so too. There's not very much flavor of rosewater, maybe just a hint. It's a little breadier. The texture to me reminds me a bit of a panettone, like an Italian Christmas cake. A little buttery, some dried fruit in there. I could see eating this for breakfast with a little bit of butter on it.
Yeah, and I think that this one, I don't know if it's the lack of rose water or just the fact that because of that, I'm enjoying the taste more. I think this one tastes less sour to me too.
I think we're in agreement. Cheap plum cake wins.
Cheap plum cake wins out over good plum cake.
Sometimes more expensive just isn't better. So thank you for joining us for Snacks from the Stacks. I'm Eric Ensley, curator, and this is Meredith Ringel. And we wanted to thank you for coming into our house today and sampling some plum cakes with us. Catch us next time. Thank you.
Bye.